At Sierra, discover joyous deals on great gifts for everyone on your list. Like cozy slippers, ski gear, fishing poles, bikes, large kayaks, even larger canoes. Whew, which might lead to another discovery. Wrapping gifts is the only sport you need to stay fit this season. 'Tis the season to discover great gifts at unexpectedly low prices. Sierra, let's get moving.
And Doug.
Here we have the Limu Emu in its natural habitat, helping people customize their car insurance and save hundreds with Liberty Mutual. Fascinating. It's accompanied by his natural ally, Doug.
Limu? Is that guy with the binoculars watching us?
Cut the camera. They see us.
Only pay for what you need at libertymutual.com.
Liberty, 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 liberty.
Savings vary. Underwritten by Liberty Mutual Insurance Company and affiliates. Excludes Massachusetts.
The Last Show with David Cooper, where bad therapy meets good radio.
Most reports on social media use often warn us of addiction. Social media bad. However, there's a new study that suggests many of us aren't actually as hooked as we might think we are. We're going to explore what's really going on with your video and photo sharing app habits here with Dr. Ian Anderson, who's done research in this area. He's a psychology researcher at the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech more affectionately. Ian, welcome to the program.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
I'm sure we've all seen videos, YouTube clips, whatever, of people, probably not researchers, talking about social media addiction. Often these are not quite the full story, or they get it wrong. How do you define addiction and social media addiction when you're actually doing like psychology research?
So the actual clinical form of addiction that we use as a construct in psychology has like 6 components. One is how often you spend time thinking about the use of an app. Another is if you have urges to use it. Another is if it modifies your mood. So if you use it to forget about your personal problems, if you can't cut down on your use, if you have withdrawal symptoms, and finally, if it has a negative impact on your life. So actually, you have to score pretty high on all of those things in order to qualify for even being at risk of an addiction. So the way we use addiction colloquially often doesn't quite fit with that more comprehensive definition.
Well, I think that sets the stage here for what you investigated, this idea that people are overestimating their use, in this case, Instagram. I guess that's kind of a nice finding when it comes to social media engagement, when we often hear negative ones. Walk me through what you studied and how you found it.
Yeah, so we were really interested in the way that there's sort of a mismatch between the reality of how people are using social media and the way that we talk about it. So the paper that we published includes 4 things, and there's 2 main studies on Instagram users, and then 2 supplemental analyses, and one is a news analysis and one is a quick survey that we did of some TikTok users. So the 2 Instagram studies, the first, we looked at a semi-nationally representative sample to get an idea of what percentage of US adults are actually addicted to Instagram and how many think they're addicted to Instagram. And we found that while only 2% of people are actually falling into the at-risk for clinical addiction category, almost 20%, it's about 18 is the actual number, think that they're addicted to Instagram, right? And then in the second study, we were thinking, what are the consequences of that? Is that problematic that people are misapplying this addiction language to their usage? And so in the second study, we basically found that when you increase perceived addiction, so if you make people perceive themselves as more addicted to Instagram, it can reduce their feelings of control over their use and also make them blame themselves more for overusing the app.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the 2 supplemental analyses basically supported this finding with Instagram, right? The first one was a survey of TikTok users, and we find a big overestimation among these TikTok users as well, right? So only 9% are actually at risk for addiction, while 59% perceive themselves as addicted to TikTok.
And just that perception can cause them damage.
Yes. So basically, like the perception of addiction is causing these sort of downstream negative effects related to people, which could probably, impair their ability and motivation to manage their use.
That's such an interesting thing. And I think it speaks well to this distinction between habit and addiction. For example, every day I brush my teeth the correct number of times. I'm not disclosing that number in case my dentist is listening. But I have a friend who brushes his teeth like 75 times a day, so much so he's caused damage to his gums. There's a difference between a habit, even if you're doing that habit a lot, and addiction. And I think a lot of people don't understand that when it comes to social media use.
Yeah, absolutely. And for example, I'm a researcher of habits, right? That was where I originally came from. And one of the key things in that scientific literature is how do we, distinguish habits from addiction? Are habits different from compulsions, and these kind of things? And actually, even within the addiction science part, when I started reading that, I found that there are a lot of addiction scientists who can't agree whether addiction to behaviors like social media use even really exists, because they're quite different from like substance addictions, right? Because, you become chemically dependent on a substance like alcohol or a drug, but you can't really become chemically dependent in the same way on a behavior.
I've heard hazy ideas about becoming chemically dependent on the endorphins or the adrenaline you get from social media, but is there any truth to that kind of thinking or that kind of process in our brain?
Right. So there's not much concrete scientific evidence that shows that would be the case, at least as far as I'm aware.
Got it. So why do you think it is that this word addiction gets tossed around so freely when describing social media, if the evidence doesn't really support it or just supports it in a smaller fraction than people think?
Yeah. So one of our supplementary analyses that we did in the paper actually points to one of the reasons, and that's that the phrase social media addiction is really way more commonly used in the media when they're talking about heavy, like highly frequent social media use. So if you tracked the amount of articles containing the phrase social media addiction versus social media habit, you find that there are almost 100 times as many that talk about social media addiction versus having a social media habit. So this kind of like potentially pathologizing framing of addiction is really pervasive across media, and I think it helps enforce addiction as the norm, and like meaning like the way that we describe heavy social media use colloquially. And I think that like those two things are pretty strongly tied, as well as the fact that strong habits are often difficult to control, and strong habits to use social media can feel like addiction even if they're not.
Ironically, you're skewing the results by coming on a radio program, getting the correct framing out. There's now one more instance of a media conversation. I'm getting silly at this point.
You're correct, though.
What would a better or more accurate public conversation about social media habits look like? Like, how would you want folks out there, reporters, newspapers, people writing blogs, how would you want them to talk about social media engagement when they're talking about habits and stuff?
I mean, I think what I'm seeking is people to talk about it in a more scientifically accurate way, right? Because this addiction construct, if you're looking at the sample in our study, we had like 35% of the sample who have strong social media habits. And if you look at daily users, it's 50% of the sample, versus only 2% or less are addicted or potentially addicted to using Instagram. So I think if we can try to almost reverse that proportion of the way that we talk about it currently, that would actually match more accurately onto the percentage of people that this is referring to.
If someone listening thinks they're addicted to a social media app, Instagram, TikTok, what you mentioned earlier, I think is so valuable. Believing you're addicted when perhaps you're not can have some negative downstream effects. Beyond that, what would you want them to know? What signs would you want them to look for to kind of understand whether they do have a problem or not?
Right. Yeah. So I would go seek out this scale that we used, honestly, which is called the Bergen Social Media Addiction Scale. And if you did take it and get a score that's really high, it has these different components. So if you're experiencing like severe life conflict with your social media use, severe feelings that like you're restless if you've been prohibited from using it, like severe lack of ability to cut down on your use, like these kind of things, like experiencing that to a severe degree, then that's the point at which you want to actually talk to a clinician. But it's really important to kind of separate those things from whether or not it's just that you have a really strong habit that you could potentially use habit disruption techniques to fix.
Dr. Ian Anderson is a psychology researcher at California Institute of Technology. Ian, I've enjoyed this conversation. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Of course. Thank you for having me, David.
The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in more places that could expose you more to identity theft. But LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, our US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Don't face drained accounts, fraudulent loans, or financial losses alone. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.